The snow and ice will melt, and that will lead to what's in store Wednesday night in Hartford between UConn and St. John's, which isn't just the game of the year in the Big East. It's one of the games of the year in college basketball. Now, I sat right here in this studio throughout the offseason, and I love this studio. I'm so attached to this studio because when you're in a place long enough, you feel like it's home, and I feel at home in this studio. And one of the things when I was looking ahead to this season that I really, really looked at hard was that St. John's and UConn was the burgeoning rivalry in college basketball. And up until last season, it had not been a rivalry because UConn was so dominant. I went back and I looked at it. Luke Hornacek retired in 1992. From 1992 up until now, UConn has won 6 national championships, and St. John's has won 6 NCAA tournament games. That tells you all you need to know about the history of these two programs. But Rick Pitino has changed all that. Rick Pitino moved the needle, even though St. John's didn't have the ending of the season that it wanted last year when it lost to Arkansas in the second round of the NCAA tournament. But Rick Pitino is showing this season that St. John's run last year was no fluke. St. John's has won 13 games in a row. St. John's defensive performance on Saturday against Creighton was ridiculous, and I'm going to put it into context. Creighton went on the road and scored 90-plus points last Wednesday when it won at UConn. And then Creighton, 3 days later, only got 52 points against St. John's. St. John's decision to put Dylan Mitchell into a more expanded role changed this season. And I said it early in the season when I was at a St. John's practice. I said it, obviously, when I saw St. John's having point guard issues early in the season. Dylan Mitchell is to this St. John's team what Andre Jackson was to the first UConn team in 2023 when Dan Hurley won a national title at UConn. And in his last 3 games, Mitchell has 17 assists and 1 turnover. Another storyline that's happening with St. John's is right now the burgeoning play of Bryce Hopkins at power forward. Bryce Hopkins in his last 2 games has gotten 38 and 20. Bryce Hopkins dropped 15 and 10 on Saturday against Creighton. This is the player that we saw before he had an injury. And you add those two with Zuby Ejiofor, you can make a case that St. John's front court with Mitchell, Hopkins, and Ejiofor, I'm not saying they're better than these programs, but you can make a case that St. John's front court deserves to be in the conversation when you talk about the Michigan front court, when you talk about the Florida front court, when you talk about the North Carolina front court. Those are fair conversations to have. Now, with that said, UConn is a proud champion. UConn came out and was dominant on the road at Villanova on Saturday night in Philadelphia. And to me, a big thing to keep an eye on in this game, Wednesday night in Hartford, a game that you want to be locked in on like it's the Super Bowl, is this. UConn was not able to get major mileage out of its bench when St. John's played UConn a couple of weeks ago at Madison Square Garden. Only one player off the bench for Dan Hurley's squad played double-figure minutes. UConn on Saturday against Villanova had 22 points off the bench. It had 6 against St. John's at Madison Square Garden. Role players always play better at home. Another thing to keep an eye on, St. John's physically overwhelmed UConn in the paint and on the backboard the first time these two teams played. Will Reed, will Caravan be able to stay on the floor for the Huskies? And for St. John's, this is the game that you need to win to be in the pole position for the second straight year to win a Big East regular season title outright. Because I'll tell you what, there's a really good chance if UConn holds serve at home that UConn and St. John's will share the Big East regular season title. UConn, after this game on Wednesday, will host Seton Hall and then travel to Marquette, who's obviously had a very difficult season, to wrap up the regular season. St. John's has to beat Villanova Saturday at Madison Square Garden, has to beat Georgetown at Madison Square Garden, and then has to win at Seton Hall. So a little bit easier of a schedule for UConn than St. John's after this game. But if St. John's gets a 2-game lead on UConn with a win on on Wednesday, it is going to be very difficult to see St. John's relinquish the opportunity to win its second straight outright Big East regular season title. And one of the things you look at in this type of dynamic is the historical impact. And I went back and looked. St. John's has won 3 straight meetings against UConn, 2 last year and 1 this year. St. John's has not won 4 straight games against the Huskies since the late 1980s. And the 4th game that happened during that run happened during Jim Calhoun's first season as UConn's head coach. So if you're really looking at it, it has been about 40 years since St. John's won 4 games against UConn. But that's what's on the table on Wednesday night in Hartford. The game of the year in the Big East, a league that obviously is not going to have great representation in the NCAA tournament. And one thing that we're finding as time progresses, the gap between St. John's and UConn and the rest of the league is significant. Kevin Willard has done a great job at Villanova, bringing Villanova back to the NCAA tournament discussion, but it feels like right now there is a major, major gap between both of those programs and everybody else in the Big East. The Big East, again, is a league that is in a very interesting position because we have now the majority of college basketball in terms of the NCAA tournament at large situation going to be represented from the ACC, the Big Ten, the Big East, and the SEC. And I know all of these things are cyclical. And I know 2 years ago, in 2024, the Big East only got 3 teams in, and it would have gotten more in if we didn't have a slew of bid stealers during championship week. But the facts are the facts. In 2 out of the last 3 years, barring something unforeseen at the Big East tournament, the Big East is only going to have 3 teams in the NCAA tournament. And that's something, again, that is something the league has to look at as a major, major problem moving forward. But there are no problems for the league on Wednesday because everything is focused on one thing, and that's Hartford, Connecticut, for the game of the year in the Big East. Now, UConn is also in a situation where it has bigger goals ahead. Not to say St. John's doesn't, but UConn has bigger goals ahead than just beating St. John's on Wednesday and retaining the right to obviously win a Big East regular season title. UConn right now is slated to be a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. And UConn, for that to happen, is in a situation where it's not going to have that many quad 1 wins left on the table. UConn, should it beat St. John's, will add a quad 1 win to its resume. Now, with that said, one thing that happened with the shift with Houston and Iowa State losing is UConn, at least as of today, is forecasted to be the 1 seed in the South region. That would mean, and a lot has to happen for things to fall into place for this to happen, but that would mean that if UConn were to close things out and be the 1 seed in the South region on Selection Sunday, the 2 seed would likely be Kelvin Sampson and the Houston Cougars. And the regional site for the South region this year is at the Toyota Center in downtown Houston. The in-between day press conference for Dan Hurley at the podium the day before UConn was getting set to play an Elite 8 game against Houston for the right to go to the Final Four at the Toyota Center in Houston would be more of a must-watch than the Academy Awards for the average person on the street.